This is text problem 7-2, and we're given a table here with a whole bunch of information about our population, and then it's going to ask us some questions about the labor force, the unemployed within the population. So let's flip over and first get some definitions under our belt. So here are definitions from your textbook of unemployment and labor force. So unemployment, we're told, is the total number of adults aged 16 years or older who are willing and able to work and who are actively looking for work but have not found a job. So this is where an economics definition differs somewhat from your English dictionary definition of unemployment. We generally think of someone who's unemployed as just somebody who does not have a job. But economists require, in order for you to be counted as unemployed, that you're not only don't have a job, but that you're looking for a job. So unemployed people are people who don't have jobs but are actively looking for them. And then the labor force are all the individuals aged 16 years and older, people who are old enough to work, who either have jobs or are looking and available for jobs. And the number of employed plus the number of unemployed equals the labor force. So there are three separate sort of groups of people here. Let me grab my pen here. So first of all, we have the labor force eligible people, people who could be in the labor force and maybe are or aren't. So labor force eligible. And these are people who are old enough to work, so we usually consider that to be ages 16 through 65, so normal working age. So they're working age. They're also non-institutionalized, meaning they're not in jail, and non-military, because whatever economists came up with all these definitions, I guess, decided that military jobs are so different from any other job that we're just going to count them in a whole separate kind of category. They're not included in the labor force. So anybody who's eligible to be in the labor force is someone who's the right age to work, is not institutionalized, and is not in the military. But then that person has to decide whether to actually be in the labor force. What does it mean to be in the labor force? And grab my pen. There we go. So someone who's in the labor force, the pen's going away. Here's the pen. That's annoying. Someone who's in the labor force is someone who is labor force eligible. So they meet all of the requirements for being in the labor force, plus they either have a job, which we called employed, and that's a non-military job, or they are looking for a job, and we call those people unemployed. The third type of person that we have is really a subset of the labor force, and those are the unemployed. So we'll put them over here. Oh, that's tiny font. Unemployed are those who, again, are labor force eligible because the unemployed are part of the labor force, remember. So they have to be labor force eligible and also have to not have a job and be looking for a job. Okay, so those are the three primary concepts that we need to understand in order to be able to work this problem. People are either labor force eligible or they're not. And then among those who are labor force eligible, they're either employed or they're not. And if they are either employed or unemployed, looking for a job, then they're considered to be in the labor force. So let's go back to our question and see what they want to know. So the first question is, what is the total population for this community or society? So we're given the number in the labor force, we're given the number in the military, the number who are not adults, the employed adults, institutionalized adults, and the non-military, non-institutionalized adults. So we really just, at this point, get to go to town adding these numbers. So we'll add the labor force, everybody who's in the labor force, 208.67, plus the adults in the military, because remember, if you're in the military, you're not in the labor force, so we want to add them as well to find our total population. The non-adult population, which again are not included in that labor force number, so we want to add them, 53.53. Then we're given the employed adults, but remember, the employed adults are included in the labor force. So since we've already added the number for the labor force, we don't want to add the number here for the employed adults. But then the institutionalized adults and the non-military, non-institutionalized adults who are not in the labor force, the last two lines here, still are not included in the labor force, so we'll add them in as well. So 2.11 plus 37.84. So the only thing to remember here as we're going down adding all the numbers is that the employed adults were already included when we added the labor force number, so we won't add it again. All the rest of these, though, we're just going to add together, and we get our total population is 305.14 million. 305.14 million. Check. Good job. The next question is to calculate the total number of unemployed people. Well, our table doesn't tell us how many people are unemployed, but let's remember from our definition of unemployed, or from our definition of labor force, that the labor force is the number of employed plus the number of unemployed. So these are people who are labor force eligible, don't have a job, and are looking for a job. Those are the unemployed people that we're looking for here at this part of the question. We are given in our table the total labor force as well as the employed adults. And we know that the labor force is the employed adults plus the unemployed adults. So we can just subtract to find unemployment. So we'll take our labor force, 208.67, minus the employed adults, 190.19, and that should leave us with our number of unemployed, since labor force is employed plus unemployed. So 18.48 million is our unemployed population. Next, we need to calculate the unemployment rate. All right, so let's go back over here, and I have a page here with the definition of unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate, anytime you see the word rate, it just means a percent. So here the unemployment rate is the percent of the total labor force that is unemployed. And how we calculate that then is just the number unemployed divided by the number of the labor force, and then we'll multiply it by 100 so we get a percent. So we need our number of unemployed divided by our number in the labor force and multiply by 100. So over here in our table we have all the numbers that we need, luckily. Our number of unemployed we just calculated was 18.48. Divide that by the number in the labor force, which we're given is 208.67. And then we'll multiply that by 100 so that we've got a nice percent. And our labor for or our unemployment rate rather is 8.856. It wants us to round to 2 decimal places, so that rounds up to 8.86. 8.86%. Check. And the last part of the question wants us to calculate the labor force participation rate. Now, this, again, is a rate, so it's a percent, and the labor force participation rate is just the percent of all the people who are eligible for the labor force who are actually in the labor force. So how many people who can participate in the labor force are participating. That will be our labor force participation rate. And so we just, to calculate that, we do the same thing we did to find the unemployment rate. You take the number in the labor force divided by the number of labor force eligible folks, and then multiply that by 100. And in terms of what we're given in our table, that would be the number of the labor force divided by the number in the labor force plus the number who are eligible for labor force but aren't in the labor force, right? So that would be our total number of labor force eligible, because the ones who are in the labor force are labor force eligible, but then the ones who are not in the labor force but are eligible also count for the bottom of the fraction here. So we need to take our number in the labor force plus our number of non-institutionalized, non-military adults who are not in the labor force. And then we have our total number who are labor force eligible. So we'll take our number in the labor force divided by number in labor force plus the number of non-institutionalized, non-military adults not in the labor force. Then we'll multiply that by 100. So, pull up our calculator again. And the first thing I'll do is figure out the bottom of that fraction. So I want the number of labor force eligible people. So that's the number who are in the labor force. Obviously, they're labor force eligible because they are in the labor force. And then plus this bottom line here, which are people who are non-military and non-institutionalized adults, which means they're labor force eligible, but they're not in the labor force. So we want to add these in to get our total number of labor force eligible. So I'll add the 37.84. So the bottom of my fraction there is going to be this number, the 246.51. The top of my fraction is just the number in the labor force. So the top of my fraction is the 208.67, and the bottom of my fraction is 246.51. 208.67 divided by 246.51, and then multiply it by 100 so you have a nice percent. And our answer for our labor force participation rate, the percent of people who are labor force eligible and are actually in the labor force, is 84.649%, and we're rounding to the nearest one decimal place, so that stays at an 84.6. And there you have it. If you have any more questions, feel free to stop by my office hours or shoot me an email.